Welcome to South Asian Environment Dialogue, the program being brought on by the Climate Channel Canada in collaboration with the Plurals and the No TV Bangla is a Bangladeshi YouTube channel. And for last, I think many months, we have been discussing a range of issues on environment and climate change. And now with this COP26 in Glasgow coming up within a month and a week time, this is a time we thought that we start a special series in Climate Channel when we'll be discussing with very key personalities on climate change negotiation from civil society, from politics, from academics, who will say that what is going to happen in Glasgow, what is expected to happen in Glasgow. And I start the series with my very good friend, Harjeet Singh. Harjeet, welcome to the show. Harjeet is the senior advisor in Climate Action Network International, one of the biggest civil society kind of platform in the world. And also he has been the former head of climate in the another international network, ActionAid to be precise. So, Harjeet, as I said, that it's a very interesting COP. We are just a month and a week away from the COP to start. And if you look at the developments leading to the COP, first of all, we didn't have the last COP. So in 2020, we didn't have a COP. And then Biden coming as the US president and US almost forcing back into the global climate geopolitics. Then IPCC report came up about a month back, which has been quite strong, and the predictions are quite strong. Code red, as they say. So under the circumstances, let's start with that point, that what exactly you feel that this COP will go in what direction?
Thank you, Jayanta, for having me. Always a pleasure to speak to you. I think first and foremost, we need to recognize this is not going to be a normal COP. Even if it is happening after a gap of a year, it is supposed to be a very important climate conference because, as you know, last year we were supposed to have this conference in 2020, which should have marked the operationalization of Paris Agreement, which was also the year when $100 billion per year was supposed to be given by rich countries to the developing world, and many other processes were supposed to start. So from that perspective, it is an important climate conference having after a gap of a year, but because of the COVID situation, it's not going to be a normal one. There are many things that have happened over the last few months. Of course, the latest IPCC report. There's also a synthesis report from UNFCCC. China has made an announcement of not funding coal outside its national borders. US has increased climate finance. But even if you put all this together, it looks very bleak because we are still going to a 3-degree, 4-degree warmer world. That's exactly what IPCC told us. So yes, there have been some positive signals. The world is gearing up with mixed feelings to this COP. But yes, we are still very far from where we should have been by now.
Well, we'll be kind of try to deliver to the specific issues. But before that, do you expect any dramatics to happen? Because say there'll be a leaders summit here, like the Paris one, where we find that Paris has been all said and done one of the successful COPs in the recent time, came up with an agreement and all that. So with this leaders summit, with Biden trying to be a leader in the global climate negotiation, especially after whatever has happened in Afghanistan, and China is also trying to play its own role. So all said and done, do we expect any dramatic announcement like a sharp emission card or something from the global emission leaders?
Well, unfortunately, not. Yes, there have been some announcements, but we are not now expecting anything major to happen, except a few countries who are going to submit their NDCs or climate action plans, as we call them in simple words. And India is going to be one of those very likely. But again, we know what India is going to put forward. So it's not going to be extremely dramatic. eyes are always on European Union, US, China, and India, and all have made their announcements, their pledges. UK also increased the target. But of course, when you look at what rich countries have done so far, it's not close to their fair shares. And when they keep talking about their national circumstances, yet put pressure on developing countries without putting money on the table, which is so vital for any kind of ambition that you would like to increase in developing countries, I really don't see anything dramatic that can happen unless
important cog in the wheel. I think the most important cog in the wheel. But before we go to the money, as you said about that, you don't expect any dramatics to happen. In the last few months, especially a special summit organized by US President, I think after 100 days after assuming his office, the net zero idea has been picking up. It's being now, everybody's talking about net zero. India being pressurized to come up with this net zero target. So all of them are talking about net zero. So do you think this net zero is going to be a key kind of phrase in the coming, every COP, Harjeet, this country's come up with a new jargon, new phrase. So is net zero the new jargon on the table?
Oh, absolutely. They, especially the UK presidency, has made it quite a buzzword just to make sure that they have something to say, that they brought the whole world to an agreement on net zero. And for your viewers, I should unpack that net zero refers to achieving an overall balance between greenhouse gas emissions that are produced or taken out of the atmosphere. Now, technically, it makes a lot of sense because this used to happen naturally. So you have some emissions because we are burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, but then you have natural ecosystems that were absorbing like forests and oceans. But the way rich countries and corporations have twisted the whole concept just to make sure they can delay climate action because they are relying on some future technologies. They are making pledges. We'll become net zero by 2050, we'll become net zero by 2060, and our corporation or our country. But in reality, what you need is a short-term plan. When you look at what IPCC is saying, it's about halving our emissions by 2030 and becoming net zero by 2050.
Absolutely.
And if you apply equity lens, rich countries have to achieve the target way before developing countries. That's how equity needs to be applied. But if rich countries are also going to be hovering around 2050 target and depending on some future technologies that is going to bail them out, or playing with unproven technologies now, such as geoengineering or solar radiation management, this is something that is not going to help us because by declaring a target of net zero and getting a pat on your back, but not being able to save the climate, the crisis that we are in, it's not going to be helpful. So, and develop plans or attract investments. It is not the be all and end all of climate finance. So $100 billion is a drop in the ocean, but a very important drop that is going to drive the kind of transformation that is needed. And unless you put that kind of a money every year, you also cannot expect developing countries to make policy changes. $100 billion was supposed to be a trust building measure that would indicate the developing world that yes, we are serious about making that transformation. We are going to help provide you a helping hand. We are going to meet the obligation as rich countries because we are the ones responsible for the crisis. And if $100 billion is not real, it is not going to give confidence to countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, all those bigger economies who have to make that transition first to even change their policies or move away from fossil fuels. How do you do that? And that has been a major gap. And if you look at that data even more closely, you find that on adaptation, which is so important as you are mentioning, different cities and areas are now going to be affected by climate change, you need to adapt well in advance. And that figure is around $20 billion a year, which is nowhere sufficient. At least it should be $50 billion. But if you go by United Nations Environment Program numbers, they are in hundreds of billions of dollars that you would need by 2030 and beyond every year.
In fact, you mentioned that. In fact, Way back in 2009 only the amount was promised. And till now we are bickering on that. And till now the world leaders have not come to an agreement how they will provide that money. There's all this controversy between the public finance and the private finance. So do you think this particular issue will continue, that how much will be private finance, how much public finance? And there are also allegations that the bilateral finance has been turned into climate finance, so to say. So is this going to continue?
Absolutely. So this remains the most contentious issue, not only around $100 billion, but also we need to go beyond. So there are a number of discussions that are happening that this goal is only until 2025. The Paris Agreement very clearly mentions that this should be a floor and then it needs to be revised upwards. And in fact, now the demands that are coming that we should not talk about $100 billion a year. In fact, we should talk about $500 billion from 2020 to 2024, or some countries are saying $600 billion, if you include 2025. So you may be able to say COP is a success because so many countries declared net zero target, but that kind of a smoke screen is not going to fool the climate system, because disasters are already hitting us at 1 degree temperature rise. If temperatures continue to rise, it's going to hit us, whether we use, net zero buzzword or many others that we may like to create.
Absolutely. I think I was trying to decode the IPCC report city-wise in South Asia. And I was just looking at the Indian cities. It looked very interesting. The Delhi from the political capital is going to turn into the heat capital of the country. Mumbai from the financial capital is going to turn around the rainfall capital of the country. Kolkata from the cultural capital is going to turn into the cyclone capital of the country. So that's where the IPCC report is predicting. So you are saying that only announcing net zero doesn't make any sense. If you announce it, you have to do it at a very certain time frame so that it does make sense. But all said and done, as you said earlier, the finance is a major issue. So where do you see the finance things are going up? There are a few announcements as of now, but overall, what do you think finance is going up?
Well, the picture is again not looking good on finance. There was a recent report by OECD countries claiming that they have already achieved $80 billion target. The shortfall is only of $20 billion. But the diagnosis of that number says that it's full of loans and guarantees, which is not going to help anybody, because the scale of finance that you need is in trillions. $100 billion was supposed to be the floor, and largely public finance. So we have to talk about money developing countries. It was create a policy in 2020. That was the commitment. Experiment. So you actually need develop plans for $100 billion. By the time you start with the be-all and end-all of climate finance, 2025, $100 billion is a drop in the ocean, but a very important drop, and that is going to drive the kind of that $500 billion needed. And unless you put that kind of a money every year, you also cannot expect developing countries to make policy changes. $100 billion was supposed to be a trust building measure that would indicate the developing world that yes, we are serious about making that transformation. We are going to help provide you a helping hand. We are going to meet the obligation as rich countries because we are the ones responsible for the crisis. And if $100 billion is not real, it is not going to give confidence to countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, all those bigger economies who have to make that transition first to even change their policies or move away from fossil fuels. How do you do that? And that has been a major gap. And if you look at that data even more closely, you find that on adaptation, which is so important, as you are mentioning, different cities and areas are now going to be affected by climate change. You need to adapt well in advance. And that figure is around $20 billion a year, which is nowhere sufficient. At least it should be $50 billion. But if you go by United Nations Environment Program numbers, they are in hundreds of billions of dollars that you would need by 2030 and beyond every year.
In fact, you mentioned that. In fact, way back in 2009 only the amount was promised. And till now we are bickering on that. And till now, the world leaders have not come to an agreement how they will provide that money. There's all this controversy between the public finance and the private finance. So do you think this particular issue will continue, that how much will be private finance, how much public finance? And there are also allegations that the bilateral finance has been turned into climate finance, so to say. So is this going to continue?
Absolutely. So this remains the most contentious issue, not only around $100 billion, but also we need to go beyond. So there are a number of discussions that are happening that this goal is only until 2025. The Paris Agreement very clearly mentions that this should be a floor and then it needs to be revised upwards. And in fact, now the demands that are coming that we should not talk about $100 billion a year. In fact, we should talk about $500 billion from 2020 to 2024, or some countries are saying $600 billion, if you include 2025. So because 2020 is gone and nobody is talking about it. So we have to talk about money. As I said in the beginning, it was supposed to start in 2020. That was the commitment. So you actually need $500 billion by the time you start with a new target starting 2025. And that $500 billion has to be real, and rich countries have to put forward the plan for that $500 billion.
And you don't see that happening immediately.
You don't see that coming. And whatever is being put on the table is not a real money.
So that also kind of triggers another question. Do you think that, when you need to have money on the table, the governments are all there, but do you think that agencies like IMF, there's a wider global agencies need to be linked with UNFCCC for understanding that from where this money will come? Do you see that widening of that is required?
Indeed, when we talk about finance, we talk about two things broadly. One, this $100 billion, which is kind of a seed money for that transformation. And second is about financial flows. This is where we need to talk about trillions. If development finance that is coming in the form of loans or, projects between different corporations and different countries, that involves trillions of dollars. India's own NDC that they submitted in 2015 talked about $2 trillion budget that is required to implement actions on mitigation, adaptation, and even loss and damage until 2030. So the world needs trillions of dollars. And this is where all the multilateral and bilateral institutions like World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, and African Development Bank, they all need to make sure that whatever finance is coming is climate compatible. It is reducing emissions, it is making the development green, but also making us resilient to climate disasters that we are facing now and in future.
Great. And okay, I think we have discussed the finance part a bit. We'll be going to other issues, but before that, as because this whole issue of India and other countries have been raised by you, India is in a bit of a middle path. On one side, it is one of the most vulnerable country. The other side, it's not in a position to seek money. It feels that it's big enough to seek money. It's a kind of a catch-22 situation for India. And now recently with Biden administration putting pressure for India to come up with this net zero plan, India is a bit of a dilemma. So how you see that Indian contingent, Indian negotiators taking a stand? What kind of stand they may take? India in particular and the basic countries in general, what's your take on that?
Well, India is already under tremendous pressure. John Kerry, US Secretary, was here. Alok Sharma, the incoming president of COP, he was here in India, and putting a lot of pressure on India to adopt net zero target. And what India did agree to is to revise its target upwards, because India is going to have more ambition on renewable energy. And they have been talking about it for a long time, but now they are going to put that as per the plan. But on net zero, India is very hesitant, and for all the right reasons. The most important thing on net zero is agreeing on a year.
Yes.
If you compare it with China, China is talking about becoming net zero before 2060. Imagine China with all its might and resources is looking at 2060 as a target. 2060 as a target. And for India, which is 1/5 of China's economy in terms of size, and still so many poor people living below $2 a day. For India to think of a year is not easy. And a lot of infrastructure is yet to be built. And again, if you connect it with finance, there is no assurance of long-term finance. So for a country like India to agree to that net zero is never going to be easy. But when developed countries put pressure on a country like India, they don't couple it with finance. They only put pressure, and because India is the fourth largest economy or third largest country, if you remove European Union, that's why India is facing under pressure. But in terms of emissions also, it's 1/5 of what China's emissions
Absolutely.
are. Nobody talks about that. And I think India also needs to be stronger in its communication in saying,
yes, I think absolutely.
Putting pressure on us is not fair, is undue, because we have so much of development deficit still. And on what basis you are expecting us to make that kind of a commitment if finance is not coming through? So I think while India is talking about finance, but it's not connecting the dots.
Absolutely. I think India's communication and the way India presents itself in the COP, in the last few COPs, could have been better, to say the least. I think India really has a lot of points to take on, but they seem to be quite hesitant, defensive, not really knowing that where do they stand. So that's some confusion in the Indian area. But another point is, because we are talking about this net zero, Harjeet, in Paris Agreement and otherwise, we saw something called peaking period, when the countries will peak and then go down. So I think peaking year comes much before the net zero. So unless you talk about peaking year and fix a date for that, how you can talk about net zero? What do you feel about it?
No, exactly. And that is another challenge. So for India to first assess when it can peak.
I'm not talking about India only. I'm talking all countries.
All
they
countries
need to come out with the peaking year.
Absolutely. So in fact, all rich countries should have peaked years ago, right?
Yes,
absolutely. For them, it's always about going down. But for developing economies who still have a lot of industrialization to be done to provide jobs to their citizens, for them, emissions need to go up. This is where we talk about the equity. This is where we talk about how you need to allow developing countries to continue to increase their emissions. Of course, you provide them technology, and even they can peak much faster. Let's speak of China. China said that it's going to become carbon neutral before 2060, but it also has a target of peaking, which is 2030. And as recent as the speech by China's President Xi at UNGA, it reaffirmed it's going to peak before 2030. So which means in the next few years. So imagine China is going to peak before 2030, yet it's going to take 30 long years to become
net zero.
So for a country like India and others who are still developing, it is extremely difficult. And that's how rich countries who cannot afford to increase their emissions, it's not fair. They only have to bring it down, and bring it down dramatically, so that there is some space left for developing countries to continue to grow, because that transition from fossil fuels, which needs to happen urgently, but cannot happen immediately. Right? So they will need to get some time to make that transition. So clearly, rich countries have to cut down their emissions dramatically now with a very ambitious plan.
Another point comes up, because we're talking about finance repeatedly. This is a very important call in the will, as we said. COVID and the pandemic that has been kind of rushing through this world for the last 2 years. Do you feel that these countries can actually show COVID as an example of not putting enough money on the table? The other day, I was talking to a senior Bangladesh minister, Hassan Saab, who was the former environment minister and the cultural minister now. He said he was giving a lot of examples how these countries are spending money in other sectors, and said that COVID cannot be an excuse for these countries to put less money on the table. Your take.
COVID is not an excuse, but an example of can be mobilized in trillions of dollars. When they had to bail out their industries, including fossil fuel industry and some of the bigger emitting industries like shipping and aviation, they had money, and they could provide billions and trillions and organize that overnight, literally overnight. But on climate, that has not been the case. And also, when they have to citizens who are being affected by climate disasters, they could organize billions. Hundreds of lives were lost in recently in Europe due to floods.
And that brings the question.
Exactly,
that brings the question of that brings us to the loss and damage. That the countries which have been suffering, you are mentioning about New York. New York became the page one story all over the world because it was New York. But it was happening in New Delhi or somewhere else in Pakistan or Bangladesh. Nobody beyond South Asia being bothered. So that's a question, that loss and damage. I was in Sundarban's part of India a day before. I was there yesterday, and I saw how the people are suffering. Unbelievable. They are being kind of changing, has to change their, poor people had to change their houses 4 or 5 times in their life. There have been forced migration. There have been various kind of social issues and livelihood issues. But they have not contributed anything to the climate change. So this loss and damage, which being pushed back a lot since it came into the whole discussion, do you see that loss and damage again being coming up strongly in the coming COP?
Absolutely. This is an issue about life or death. This is an issue about survival. And we have been fighting for it for a very long time. Imagine that rich countries have not even agreed to put it on the agenda. And we are talking about an issue of loss and damage, which is the now third pillar of climate action, very much an article of Paris Agreement. Yet, developed countries are not allowing for a political discussion on loss and damage. And when I say political discussion, it's about looking at a much larger picture on what's happening. Loss and damage is a result of inadequate mitigation and insufficient support for adaptation. So we have been demanding for this for a long time, and years and decades of inaction has caused this situation of loss and damage, and developing countries are suffering the most. Now climate disasters are hitting even the global north, but they have resources to recover from it. What about developing countries? And there is no mechanism that is channeling money to help people who can access relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction. And we are talking of a world where 90% of disasters are now weather related. So how do people recover in developing countries?
In fact, Harjeet, you reminded me something a poor person told me a couple of days back in Sundarbans. I was telling him that you guys have so many disasters. There have been floods, there have been storms, cyclones. Then he said that even you had cyclone, you had rainfall. It was the day I was speaking to him, Calcutta was completely inundated and flooded. So all of them had seen in the television, they said, even Kolkata is under neck deep of water, but you guys have money, so you can come out of it. We don't have money. So you need not bother about us. Just give us money, give us something which we can work on. So it really struck me. It's not about disaster. It's all about resilience. So that's a very important point you raised, that you need to, because often we're talking about people have to come out of Sundarban because there is disaster. So where this back pushing will go? Should people also go away from Kolkata, from Delhi, from Mumbai? So it cannot happen like that. So that is an extremely important point that you need to put on resilience. But then realistically, loss and damage, you feel that now in the context of the global scenario, we'll get some money separately, specifically on loss and damage, or we will continue the theoretical discussion of research and everything on loss and damage?
Well, we should have got that money years ago. As you know, we have been fighting for it for a long time. And we are going to the COP with a few demands. One, to put it on the agenda permanently for each COP so that we don't have to fight for it. That's absolutely unfair. Second, there's already an agreement to establish Santiago Network. In fact, the decision at the previous climate conference in 2019 in Madrid said it has already established Santiago Network. Now, this network is supposed to provide technical expertise to developing countries and also support them in implementing measures, to address loss and damage. That Santiago Network has to be operationalized, which means we have to agree on its governance structure, on the support that it needs to provide, and how we need to make sure that money is available for that institution to function. So there is going to be some progress on this network. But again, the kind of indication the incoming presidency UK has been giving is not forthcoming. They're only stuck on a website or a little beyond that, but not a full operationalization, or they're going to put forward their own institution. That's not something that we are going to agree to. The third part is going to be about finance. Now, this is where United Nations system has to agree to create a stream of funding that is automatic, that reaches countries in the time of crisis. And that money has to be over and above the money that has been committed for mitigation and adaptation. And that agreement needs to be there. So at this COP, we are demanding that we decide to establish such a fund. We're calling it Loss and Damage Fund. And then it needs to be operationalized in the next 12 months. So that by the time we go to the next COP, COP27, we need to have a system up and running.
Okay, that's great. That should have been happened long back, but at least sooner the better. That again bring another quick question. Here comes kind of another 5 minutes for time. South Asian countries are kind of more vulnerable countries, and they have been affected by series of climate disaster. But unfortunately, various other parts of the world, they have been regional groups, geographically regional groups. You have Africa group, other groups. But in South Asia, perhaps for the geopolitics, the India-Pakistan geopolitics, you don't have any group. Don't you think that we really need, the South Asia needs a geopolitical localized group which will talk about these issues which are common to all the South Asian countries?
Well, absolutely. This should have again happened years ago. And the reason for that, Jayanta, is not just about politics, but geography. That's why we use the term geopolitics. And in case of climate, the geography is extremely important. We share rivers, mountains, and oceans. And when a cyclone is hit and that emerges from Bay of Bengal, it affects Bangladesh and India, right? When there are floods, it affects Nepal and India and Pakistan together. So we share those ecosystems, yet we have not been able to understand how we need to coordinate at these international forums to make sure that our perspective is well articulated and we are able to put forward a demand as a sub-regional bloc. That has not happened. And yes, there is politics between India and Pakistan. But if you go down to the demands that India and Pakistan are making in international fora are exactly the same.
Exactly, that's the point they're making.
So we have to make sure that they coordinate. And that has not been happening. In fact, when there is a deadlock politically at the top level on many other issues, climate can be an icebreaker because your demands are so common. But that has not happened. So I think we need political maturity from all sides, particularly Pakistan and India, to go beyond, some of these issues, and where they have a common interest and set of common demands, they should come together.
Absolutely. I think that's the need of the hour for at least the South Asian countries. Final question, Harjeet. You are part of the global civil society voice. It's a very, very important voice. And how do you see civil society working during this COP? What are the agendas they will push and where they are leading to? Harjeet.
So, of course, we all need to make sure, and civil society is playing a very important role. As Climate Action Network, we are working with our allies and several social movements to put forward our demand to make sure that we are able to have mitigation targets which keep us below 1.5 degrees. Because when you cross that threshold, we all know it's going to be devastating. So definitely that is a very, very strong demand that we are going to the COP with. And second is finance, which cuts across so many things. And again, loss and damage is an extremely important demand because it's all about people. And if we do not have sufficient support for people who are already getting impacted, what is the point of these climate conferences? Or even if we achieve mitigation target, we know that disasters are going to continue. Even at 1 degree temperature rise, there are disasters. So clearly, we have to make sure that there is money for adaptation. There is money that enables mitigation targets, and rich countries, should come up with more ambition and real finance to help developing countries. And these climate conferences are all about obligation. and responsibility. And it's not just about, having some kind of a show or to build your profile as a host. You have to deliver for the global good.
I think we had a fascinating discussion for half an hour. And I think the last sentence that you spoke and the word you mentioned, real. And that's the most important and operative part, because we have been seeing these pledges, but we need real pledges. We have been talking about the action, but we need real action, the real money on table. So those are not being often found. So I think this is the COP26. There are a lot of pushes and pulls in this COP, with US geopolitical push, the finance push, the COVID push and pull, all are there. But end of the day, we can all understand that if COVID is a trailer, climate change is the film. And we all know how the world is going to be affected by that. Hopefully, the leaders should come out of just talking about the jargons, that whether it is net zero or something else, and do some real actions on ground, and do the needful to save this world. Thank you, Harjeet, for your time. I think we'll keep on discussing on these key issues. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.